Okay. Welcome to HYPIA's 9th research meeting, and today we will be discussing Ukrainian and Russian. I will now share the screen, and we will start with the presentation. I want to remind you that the presentation is to be kept to 15 minutes, that each of us can speak at any given time for 5 minutes straight, and that this is a controversial and delicate topic, so I trust that we will all keep it polite and respectful. And having said that, can you all see my screen now?
I can see no. I'm not seeing
right now. Yeah? Okay.
I'm not seeing your screen.
Yes, all good.
Are you seeing the screen now? I think you are.
No.
No?
I don't see the screen either.
No? Okay. Interesting, because I am sharing the screen. So let me stop sharing and let me share it again. Usman, you said you were seeing it?
Oh, yes, I could.
So how come Usman could see it and Tim and Victor couldn't? Let me share it again. I did the same process as every time, so it should be fairly straight.
I
What
see
about
a split
now?
window. I see your face and on the right, and I see the screen on the left distributed.
Yeah?
Oh.
Victor, Tim?
No.
No?
Yes.
Where are you?
All right, well, I'll stop sharing the screen in a second, so I'll go ahead, right? So this is our meeting for today, and we will start now with the initial presentation. As I said, to be 15 minutes, summarizing the readings, the 3 readings that we had for today, and then adding questions that would allow us to spark some subsequent debate, okay? So with that being said, Victor, the floor is yours.
Okay. I hope you are seeing my screen now.
Yes.
Yes.
So I've made the presentation as a PDF because sometimes I have problems with PowerPoint, but it should be seen. So I named it Misunderstanding Slavic Languages because there's a debate about that. I've been studying Russian for quite some time, and I do remember the very first problems of misunderstanding Russian, which was during an interview of Boris Yeltsin and I believe it was Carter, the president, after a meeting, an international meeting, and he directed some words to the translators and reporters who didn't translate him well, and nobody seems to have understood that even today. Well, he invited me to speak about Russian and Ukrainian. I decided because of an accidentally I was learning a word we'll see right now. So I put in Belarus and Polish. I'm learning those also. So to understand that, and that's a very crucial way for me in my meaning, because in which those languages are misunderstood. I would like to present very shortly what are the verbs, how are the verbs, aspect and modes in Russian and in the others, in those 4 at least. One of the things I have first learned is that verbs in Russian have a very easy past form. Oh yeah, because there is only one. We to form up the past of a verb, you just put in the variation for the sex or gender of the person and the designacy of past. I give it as an example, Cheetah. Cheetah is the verb for read. I will explain Cheetah and Prochitat soon. So for Cheetah, you had Chitala, Chitalo, and Chitali, depending on who reads or has read, is female, male, or plural. So we vary the enders, you put in the ending and vary the gender or the number. So very easy, okay. All actions in Russian can be expressed by two verbs, which is why we have Cheetah and Prochitat. Cheetah is the infinitive action for was reading, like generally translated as continuous verb. Was
Sorry
reading.
to interrupt,
Yeah.
but I notice I'm still seeing the title slide. Have you moved on yet?
Well, yes. The first one is the title. That's why I changed it to PowerPoint to PDF. Do you see now?
I'm still seeing the misunderstanding the Slavic languages. Is that the one you all seen?
No.
Yes.
That shouldn't be there.
Well, that's the one we're seeing, yeah.
Let's try it different.
Okay, but pay attention, Victor, to summarizing the readings, please.
So, okay. I'll try to share again. So, Cheetah is the verb for being I was reading, you were reading. Are you seeing it now?
Yeah.
So, then are you seeing the new slide
Could you
now?
clarify, please, Victor, what article is this referring to?
Now I'm saying Prochitat. Prochitat is the infinitive verb. Infinitive verb focus on the finite action. I have read. If I'm talking in the present or the future, it focuses on the action of reading and the action of having read a book. But what complicates a little is that prefixes and suffixes may also change meaning. So, and okay, it should be very easy, but Russian doesn't have subjunctive. Russian doesn't have a very neat imperfective action as us, and 2, 3 actions in the past. Generally, those are expressed by modifying or adverbs in the sentences or by the context in general. So what should be easy in the translation is not easy anymore. So you should be seeing now a touch of love. Okay, this is the verb I would concentrate in for the presentation. Because I think it's a very, very key verb, and because accidentally I've been learning it in Ukrainian too. So I'll try to explain where I'm going to. The verb Russian любить, полюбить, the aspect, the two aspects, infinite and finite, are used to like a meal, or to love a person, to love a dog, to love a meal, etc. One verb, two aspects. If you love intensively something, you полюбить something. That's the main expression. If you love a meal, you любить a meal. If you love a person, you любить a person. So both verbs are one. So it expresses liking foods, liking a person, liking a friend, and loving a friend, personal, family, romantic. So the other aspects are generally given by the context, contextual phrases, contextual adverbs, etc. Well, what I learned in the Ukrainian is that they have lubits, lubits for foods. They like foods with lubit. But for people, for falling in love, for romantic love, they use another verb, kohatsi, kohatis, zakahatsi. Zakahatsi being the one with more intensity, generally used for falling in love. Do you understand? So, going on with a touch of love, in Polish, they use lubić, polubić. You pay attention, the letters are different. They don't use a Cyrillic alphabet, but the sound is quite similar. They lubić, polubić, foods. They koshats, pakoshats, people. And the zakoshats shell when they fall in love. That here is even a different aspect of the verb, because Polish people fall in love in a pronominal way, because zakoshats shell is a pronominal verb. Well, the Belarus, to go to the end, they say "Ty mnie podobaешься," which would translate literally as "you are agreeable to me," when they like a person. They say kahats, which is about the same as kashats, when they love. And they say zakachats, a finite verb, when they fall in love. So, we're talking about reasonably near languages, but when they use, when they want to express a simple thing as liking, enjoying, and of course loving other people, they are quite different in the language. So that's the point I would like. If people don't like or love in the same way, quite the same way, that's like an open window to unlove. And that I finish by presenting the information on the files we studied. The Simpsons and the Ukrainian divide. This is a study, an article, which tells us that the same show, The Simpsons, can be ridiculed in Ukrainian and not ridiculed, or not so ridiculed, or laughable, less laughable in Russian by people who, by some person who are Ukrainian. That's about that. Summarizing this slide, that's is. They talk in Russian, they think in Russian. The person says that. So if you talk in Russian, you think in Russian. If you talk in Belarus, Ukrainian, you think in Belarus, Ukrainian. If you love your friends in Russian, if you love your friends in Ukrainian, it's quite different. Going on, cultural diversity, and this is another key phenomenon, because language and literature are very, very interrelated. And the article we said that even some classical authors do use two of the languages, of more of the languages, and even some people are not sure if their primary language is Russian or Polish or Ukrainian. So this adds to the confusion. And finally, literature, language, culture are completely interlinked. Those aspects were strongly influenced by Russian domination, by URSS domination. Russian and Ukrainian may be confused, the others too, like Polish too, like Belarus too. They speak a very similar language. However, very similar is far from similar and far from equal. Which is the native language of each people? URSS has forced the people to talk the same language for many decades, and even literature have been changed about that. So, finally, as the other article suggests, Ukrainian and Russian similarity are not as strong as we think about that. From the 5th to 9th century, all of those languages were Proto-Slavic. Then there were very difficult geopolitical division, and that brought factual alteration of the alphabets. Ukrainian, Russian, Belarus use the Cyrillic alphabet. Meanwhile, the letters are the same, but Ukrainian and Belarus has some different letters, and the pronunciation of the letters is very different. Ukrainian and Polish and the West group of languages had a very close geopolitical connection. Ukrainian and Russian present many homonyms, like that is, many languages many words that look like the same but are not the same. And Ukrainian and Belarus, they are the languages who present closer vocabulary. So the conclusion I lead to, this is like a soap of different languages, and they intermix, and also this causes both separation and both union of them. It's a bubble of small languages living on the same country for decades, and some of them are against and some of them are pro the same dominant cultures. So you can't say, it's impossible to say that those languages are similar and the same. That's it.
Victor, are there any questions that follow this presentation?
I stop sharing.
Victor,
Oi. Hey?
are there any questions as part of this presentation?
The question is, when will we understand those people? Because every time I know very few of those languages. I know a little more about Russian, but the very few I understand and hear. For instance, when I see a Putin saying something, and the translation, they don't translate. Sometimes they do translate literally, sometimes not even literally, and they don't translate it culturally. When I heard some pronunciations of the Ukrainian president, I can understand Russian and Ukrainian in a mix. I can understand what he means. But I'm sure I'm not very near to understand what he is culturally saying.
All right. Thank you, Victor. So let me now share the screen again. and let us begin the debate. Ideally, we want to pose 3 to 5 questions, right? But we can also draw upon this question that Victor was saying. And we have 60 minutes for the debate. Let me begin by saying that, in my opinion, then I'll open the floor to anybody else. In my opinion, 2 articles clearly skewed pro-Ukraine, right? Which is not to say they didn't say interesting things, but I'm saying that I do feel politically the readings were a little bit skewed towards Ukraine, particularly the one that begins saying that no one agreed with Putin's vision on Crimea, which is very easy to falsify, right? Because it's a very ambitious statement. Having said that, I think one of the important theoretical questions that are offered by the 2 articles, the one from the Simpsons and the one on the blurred lines, is the question of the native speaker. So when Victor in one of the slides said that the blurred line article poses the question of which one is the native language, I think what this article is doing is undermining the very notion of native language, right? Which is something we often do in critical linguistics, and I'm still surprised people take for granted. In fact, there is an inconsistency, for instance, in the Simpsons article between the use of native language and the use of first and second language, right? So it is said that Russian is the quote-unquote native language, which the author takes for granted, but then it says that Ukrainian is the second language for that very people, as opposed to the non-native language. So the author themselves seem to be inconsistent in the use of native or non-native language. Whereas in the blurred lines, it is clear that the author has a critical perspective on the idea of native language, hence why it's in between inverted commas. And the whole idea is that there is no prevalence of one over the other, and that there is hybridity, hence the blurred lines, right? And they also mention a hybrid dialect called Surkich. So I would like to hear more about that, but then again, you can all touch upon your preferred aspect, and now we'll open the floor to other comments. Let me go to see who is raising their hand. Tim? And then
well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Victor, for this presentation. I can sympathize with a lot of what you say. I'm somebody who's learned Polish and Russian and who's now learning Ukrainian. And in general, I notice, especially in Western Europe, there seems to be a lack of appreciation often of the differences between the Slavic languages. And my question is connected with what Carlos was saying, really, is that maybe this idea of what is native speaker or the idea of somebody having 2 simultaneous first languages. Now, forgive me, because I'm not very familiar with how one should define terms like or not use terms like native language, first language, second language, etc. But maybe one of the points in the articles was that one should not look at this the situation in Ukraine as being between Ukrainian speakers and Russian speakers very strictly, because there is a lot of gray area between. And I was wondering if you think that it is a feature of many Western European societies where we often have people who are monolingual or speakers of one language or another, that tends to make us look at other countries as if they were like our own countries, with better defined, shall we say, first languages and second languages. I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on that.
By you mean Victor or me? Tim?
Well, all of you.
Okay, all right. So let me address that, and then I'll go to Usman. So yeah, definitely there is a projection of monolingualist language ideology from Western countries towards Ukraine. And so that's part of the problem. I completely agree that the whole point of the article is to show the overlap and the hybridity of both Ukrainian and Russian. And whenever there is a redefinition of national boundaries, there is also an accompanying redefinition or attempt to redefine those boundaries between languages, which are as artificial and socio-culturally driven as those very nations. Now, Usman.
Thank you, Carlos. Timothy has raised a very interesting point. Speaking to the notion of the nation state, that a nation should be encapsulated within a state, other nations, other states. And this is a Western European concept. It has created many problematic scenarios around the world. A great deal of violence can be explained by this, and a lot of identity crises amongst peoples who may not fit the contours of nation or even nations within a state. I think this is something for us to reflect on too, because of the hybridity that was mentioned. And taking this point a bit forward, without stepping on the political too much, one thing that I find very, very devastating in discourses that are propagated by power everywhere at times is the idea that you people are not a real people. You people are artificial. We are a real people. It has come up in this context, but it's come up in many other contexts around the world because it's a kind of dehumanization. You're not a, you people aren't real. And there's two ways to tackle this. One is to recognize that all people have languages and all of them are, to a degree, constructed in artifices. All concepts of nation deep down are artifices. But at the same time, they are all real if you stand by them. And language and politics is something that you people know about more than I do, but it's something to take in the idea where we gravitate. One way to look at it was, as Victor pointed out, look at the lexical distance, look at what it really means. And then another way to look at it is, how do people perceive it, and are they willing to stand up for it? And we're seeing people stand up for this everywhere around the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Usman. Yeah, absolutely. One of the points made by Putin, as commented in the article of Blur Lines, is the claim that Ukrainians don't exist, right? And here language serves as alibi for the statement. And the second tenet of Putin's ideological claim on Ukraine as regards language is that because some people are Russian speakers, then they must be Russian as opposed to Ukrainian, right? And obviously, I think that it doesn't make much sense for us to presuppose that Putin ignores this. I think he's mindful of the fact that Ukraine does exist. He's mindful of the fact that Ukrainian is a real language, but it's in his best expansionist interest to pretend otherwise. That's how I see it. Victor?
Okay, we are bilingual in America, but we are multilingual because we are Brazilian Portuguese and we are Spanish. That's not so far from one language as you have in Europe, but whenever a Spanish come to Brazil, people say he's gringo. Oh, so he's not people, the same time it was said. I have heard many times among my friends, the friends I have known now through the internet, that Ukrainians and Belarusians are the country people, or those who are not in the main cities, in the main part of Russia. So this is a definite instrument, a definite ideology instrument that people use towards others, bringing the language. So I would like to make another question, because since I've been studying Russian, I think the Russian is the worst translated language to English, because I do have the strong impression that mostly when you translate an interview from Putin, when you translate whenever a Russian is speaking, they translate it ideologically rather than by the true translation theory. Translation theory is Scopus theory. The important in translation is to translate the content to the language. And they don't translate the content. They translate the content to the ideologic content, mostly that. I would like to see to ask you if you agree to that.
Okay, so translation as reduced to the ideological content. Okay, we'll go back to that team first, and then we can go back to that issue.
Right. Well, I'd like to comment on what Victor, you just said, and what Carlos, you said earlier. So, Victor, I'll just say that what you describe is a very, very good advertisement for learning languages and not relying on translations, so that you are able to draw your own conclusions and not the conclusions of somebody who's interpreting for you.
Yes. And it was why I started on Russian. The very reason.
Carlos, you were talking about Putin saying at the same time Ukraine is not a country, and then saying that people who speak Russian must be Russian. Now, what Putin is saying, that Ukrainian is not a nation, that surprises me in my experience with Russia, because when I was in Russia about 20 years ago, I did notice that Russians have what's called внутренний passport, or an internal passport, and заграничный passport, which means a passport as most Western Europeans would understand it, for international travel. And on the внутренний passport, on the internal passport, often you would see that there are two concepts in Russian: the гражданство, or citizenship, and национальность, or nationality, which does not mean nationality in the sense that Western Europeans would use it, but rather to which group do you belong, to which nation do you belong. And so you could belong to Russian, you could belong to Jewish, you could be classified as Jew or whatever, Uzbek, whatever. There was a movement actually to remove this from the внутренний passport, the internal passports. And I believe in internal passports in Russia, they are no longer shown, your nationalnost, your national group, because that could be discriminatory. Okay. But I mean, the idea, I'm saying that Russian society, I think since the start of the Soviet Union, has been very conscious of different ethnic groups within its territory. And so this, what Putin's statement that the Ukrainians are not a people, runs counter to the general attitude towards nationality, in Russia, in my opinion.
Right. Very interesting, Tim. I didn't know about this difference of internal passport and non-internal passport. But yeah, I was about to say that what you describe as nationalnost struck me as, ethnicity, right? And it could be, hypothetically, one could reconcile this with Putin's claim in that Putin may acknowledge the difference between Ukrainians and other Russians as a matter of nationalnost, that nonetheless should not translate into a difference of citizenship. That's how I'm thinking. Perhaps Putin can square that circle, but of course, it's very, very hard to square, and certainly not within the framework of just nationalnost, right? Victor or Usman? Usman?
We need translators. We need diplomats that understand the culture. We don't have them.
Victor, it was now Usman's turn, sorry.
Oh, excuse me.
No worries.
Oh, thank you. I just wanted to point out that this idea of the nationalities also applies to another for communist country, China. The character is Zhu, or the word is Zhu, the ideogram is Zhu. And yes, there is one nationality which is 90% of the population. I presume it's similar in the USSR, that Russians were a big part of it. But 90% are Han, Zhu, and then you have a very long list after that of hundreds. So this pattern of nation building with a utopian ideal underpinning it leads to the concept that what we call ethnic can be considered nation. And if you look at some other languages, this idea becomes even more starkly. So for example, in Urdu, we'll say Qaum as nation, but we'll say we are one Qaum, and talking about, for example, Pakistan. But then all of these things you will say, oh, this Qaum is like these people are like that, which does not refer to the entire nation. So it does get a bit ambiguous depending on your usage and intent.
Thank you, Usman. Yes, certainly the Chinese example, I'm not as familiar with the Pakistani example, but the Chinese example is very telling as well. Yeah. Victor?
Okay, sorry, I interrupted, but I misunderstood you.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, I think we need really to understand those people, good translators who understand at least one of those languages. We need good diplomats. We don't have them.
Right. Right, and that's I think a bit of Tim's point, right? That yes, we need that. Ideally, we would like to have it, but since the world it is as it is, and translators are hardly neutral, and diplomats are sometimes not doing their job, at the end of the day, it's part of our self-ownership to try and go to the original source as many times as we can, rather than delegating that to translators or diplomats or journalists, right? It's in our best interest to be well informed, even though it should be the responsibility of other people, right? But the world is as it is. Tim and then Usman.
Okay, just a quick point, but it seems that in this discussion we've been talking about two different types of, shall we say, discrimination. Firstly, there's the type of discrimination I think is most commonly discussed, where a group is seen as separate and is treated less favorably. Whereas there's another type of discrimination, in my opinion, which can be seen in the attitude of Putin, where you actually rather deny the existence of the separateness of people, that they're not the same as you. And this can also be seen, because Usman brought up China. There's a sort of unwillingness I noticed this is only personal experience, but seems to be this unwillingness for Chinese to concede that people in Taiwan, for instance, may have a separate sort of national identity. And I think that this other type of, shall we say, discrimination, not acknowledging the otherness of people, is equally harmful, but just not discussed as much. And
right. Yes, this is an idea that has been called colonial mimesis by Domert and Sheffert and Storch in a recent volume called Colonial and Decolonial Linguistics. And it's exactly this idea. The idea is that you project your understanding of languages and cultures and nations onto other people, put them in those boxes, without acknowledging the sheer possibility that there might be other concepts or ways of interpreting languages, nations, ethnicities, etc. Yeah. Usman?
Thank you, Carlos. It's very important to raise this notion which is now being talked about of colonial mimesis, because it is something very important to detect in the post-colonial society. What Timothy is pointing out is important to recognize that there are two forms of discrimination, and I believe that they're used strategically. So when you want to co-opt the elite of the society you wish to conquer, you will say, hey, we're kind of the same, man. Don't make such a big fuss. Come on, move on to our side. And then if you do capture them, then you'll start to discriminate and then see, oh, those people down there. I'm not going to name any names, but there are countries that are doing this around the world, particularly in Asia, that they have a similar minority to a country that they consider hostile, and they push that country, the same people down. And then at the same time, they'll try to persuade the elite that, hey, we're kind of the same. So it's used strategically depending on the context. Now, the logic of Taiwan, which was mentioned, I think is very interesting because it is very similar. And yet it would be interesting to superimpose that in the Ukrainian context. That argument would be like this. It would sound something like this. Ukraine would say, Okay, we are the same, but keep in mind that the original Rus was Kievan Rus. So we are the real deal. So you should be absorbed into us. And that's what Taiwan and the People's Republic have as a contest, because the people who fled to Taiwan were sort of the Kuomintang people, were the original guarantors of the Qing dynasty, the true successors. And they did take a lot of that intellectual and cultural capital to Taiwan. So that argument would be even more interesting, because they would be contesting Beijing, but we are the real ones. So you should come into us, actually. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Usman. I think this notion of the real and the derivative has come recurrently in this conversation is also important. And I think that's why, amongst other reasons, the notion of native speaker was problematized in blurring lines, as in native is somehow tied connotatively to authenticity. But what's authentic in the context of Ukraine and Russia, and Ukrainian and Russian, is rather problematic. Victor?
Just another piece to add to the question is something that we usually don't take into account, which is in that area, just similarly to what happens in Africa, there are many numbers of different white or Caucasian ethnicities which carry their own religious beliefs, which carry their own genetical racial characteristics, and which carry their own original spoken, if not written, languages. So they are different. That's not the same as saying Brazil and America has just Spanish and Portuguese. And even though they have many languages, there are many historical ethnicities and realities.
Right, exactly. Right. I was surprised by that claim of just Spanish and Portuguese in America. We have a lot of indigenous languages.
Oh, some people tell me, ask me if I speak Spanish, and it's not very uncommon.
Yeah, absolutely. Even highly educated people in the U.S. will make the assumption that Spanish is the prevailing language in Brazil. Yes, absolutely. Tim?
Yes. Well, I think in the case of the former communist countries, I think that it's even worse than what you just described, that people will think that Spanish is the main language in Brazil. Let me just tell you a story once from my own experience. I started talking to somebody in Polish, and then a colleague of mine said, well, why were you talking to him in Russian? And obviously, my point is that this other person couldn't speak Russian or Polish, but was just lumping everything together and looking at it in a very non-discriminatory way. So what I'm asking is, what do you think that we can do in order to raise people's awareness, of the diversity of, these, this area of the world?
Thank you, Tim. Now we're getting into activist area. Yeah, absolutely. I've seen this example also apropos Serbian. When I was learning Serbian, people would say, "Oh, you mean Russian?" And so, yeah, how do we turn this around, Victor?
I do believe this is our task, because we are polyglots. This is sometimes I ask if HYPIA could we have a specific word for rare languages. We could have a specific group for working diversity bound languages.
What is diversity bound languages, Victor?
Russian, Polish, all those languages specifically on that place, who are very similar yet different. So that we can make an action to make people aware that happens, because the word doesn't happen. The word in Brazil, the idea I get in Brazil, and I use I don't read national newspapers. I read Spanish. I read Italian. I read other newspapers. The idea we have in this our part of in OTAN part of the world is that Russian and Russian peoples is one and only, and they are alike. They are all beautiful. They all have beautiful women that go behind their men, and they all speak Russian. They aren't. We have just discussed that they aren't.
Usman?
Thank you. Victor has brought up a very important point. This diversity-bound languages as a kind of movement within HYPIA. It doesn't have to be externally oriented. And we don't have a precedent for HYPIA research using profanity, but I'll say this as part of the leadership of this group. People in HYPIA do have a lot of stupid notions. They say a lot of stupid shit about other languages, even as hyperpolyglots. And it is very... and that is because they may be bound by a certain corpus or a certain community of languages, and they say absolutely loathsome things outside. So even working within our community to promote the recognition of the distinct and unique nature of languages is hard work, I tell you. And so I second Victor on this, because I think it's outrageous, some of the stuff that people say. Going back to the problem, not just the solution, the fact that, for example, Victor says America has Spanish, I have been conditioned to think of America as the United States of America as opposed to the Americas. I understand why that is wrong, having speaking many of the languages of the Americas. But it is true that you subsume one identity within this, and then that shapes everything, as opposed to the Americas, where Portuguese has a very big role. And one thing I want to raise for your consideration is script. It's been mentioned already, but think of the fact that Polish doesn't use the Silic script that is making a statement itself. And so sometimes cultures may put aside the convenience. So for example, the Silic script is very convenient to subsume sounds like sh versus sh or ch versus ch, but still, and the Latin script is very inefficient for Slavic languages, but they still do it. And there's motivation that is larger than just efficiency. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and that's also important in Bosnian and Serbian. Within Serbian, for instance, there is also a generational gap in the use of Cyrillic, which is preferred by the older generation, and the Latin script, which is preferred by the more westernized younger generation. So definitely a political statement in there. Also the case of Mongolian and the transition from the Cyrillic to the Latin alphabet as part of the linguistic ideology of Pan-Latinism, or the adoption of Latin after the fall of the Ottoman Empire in 1924 as part of Ataturk's national planning. Now we go with Tim and then Victor.
No.
Yeah, first of all, it's funny that you mentioned the efficiency of the Cyrillic script. I was just joking about this with a Polish friend of mine, and I showed her that you only need 4 letters in Ukrainian when you would need over 10 in Polish. So, but coming back to the point, as an activist, Carlos, although hyperpolyglots or polyglots are going to have many different views, or maybe what we are good at doing is learning languages, and we can do this presumably quicker than most people can. So do you think there is a role for a sort of, I don't want to call it political activism, but of cultural activism, and making people who have been displaced by war feel more appreciated, simply by actually making an effort, and quite an open and public effort, to learn their languages?
Yes, but I also think that, and I'll go to Victor afterwards. Yes, but I also think that this might be problematic. I think that when we talk about learning people's language or languages, that is in part reproducing essentialist agendas, as in this is your language and now I'm coming and I'm sharing that language with you or promoting that language as if it's tied to your identity and I need to learn that language to understand you better. So again, it ties back to this problematic idea of authenticity and the treatment of languages as self-contained properties that are predicated on an ethnicity or a nationality. Having said that, I think a more interesting form of activism, I mean, learning languages is a form of activism, period, right? Whether we choose to highlight that or not is a different question. But beyond learning languages, I think there is a more fundamental level, which is the reflection on what a language is. The reflection on notions that are transversal, such as native language, foreign languages, etc. And that's what I do for the most part in the hyperpolitical activist. And the reason why it was born as a project, I created it as a project, is to denounce the artificiality and the political divisiveness that is associated to these notions, and to deconstruct that with arguments, as opposed to telling people what they should use or not to use, or trying to censor usages of that I see as problematic, right? So the way I do my part in this activism is by explaining these polyglot myths, why they're wrong, and how are they dangerous, and then suggesting alternatives. So instead of native speaker, we can say first language or second language. It's as easy as that. It doesn't need to be too complicated. Usman? Oh, sorry, it was Victor and then Usman. My fault. My bad. Victor.
Okay. I think of ourselves as anti-Babel. I have said that word. I think I am anti-Babel. The more languages I understand, the more anti-Babel I am, and that's why I'm started learning Slavic languages. Also because I mean to visit the land and talk to the people. Really talk to the people. When you talk to the people, any people in your native, your true, I don't know what word to do, your true language, I have observed that the people opens up to you, and that's what we should be. And speaking of what I spoke before, I think the Western countries have a big block, language cultural block, which I say against, that's not the word, but against the words of the Slavic languages. Because the groups that translate them as them against us.
Mm-hmm.
Is ideologically almost always we have an official translation of whatever Slavic people talk. It's they and we are us.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I meant. We should be together with them, not them against us.
I agree with you completely, Victor, but I think part of the problem is precisely to presuppose that people have one true or native language. I think that is a very dangerous idea, and that essentializes and puts people into boxes, and that's part of what is at stake when we do these binaries between them, us, etc. You see what I mean? So I think one is related to the other inevitably.
Yeah, not one language. There are 20 against some others like Western. Understand? Because when a political leader from them is translated into English, he is equally badly translated into Portuguese, and equally badly translated into French, and equally badly translated into to German.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Usman and then Tim.
Thank you. Speaking to what you said, Carlos, this is what you said had very deep observations about authenticity, about language itself being activism, and for us having reflexivity and thinking about it. That's why I'm a great fan of your work at the Hyperpolyglot Activist. and I have all the appreciation for it. And I also have a deep appreciation for what Victor has said about anti-Babel. We are basically smashing the idols. And why is this important? I want to raise the alarm with you about why what you are all saying is important now. Because post facto guilt alleviation is not a good way to approach life. So Ukraine is under hardship, and now everybody falls in love with Ukrainian. It would be nice if they had an appreciation for it before, if the awareness was done before. Other countries will go through similar crises. It is simply a matter of the cyclicality of history. And then when they go south, then suddenly we will say, oh, if only we learned more about this, that, we will go through a fad and then we'll forget about it. So the activism has to be done now. That is why I appreciate what you do with the hyperpolyglot activists. But the fact is, do it now before these nations are destroyed. This conflict will break out. Not some countries are better prepared than Ukraine, some are less prepared. And then we'll say, oh, if only, hey, look, they're not so different. Hey, look, this is their point of view. This sympathizing ex post doesn't do the same justice as having that open mind ex ante. Thank you.
I think that's a wonderful point, Usman. It's that distinction that you draw between a reactive approach and a proactive approach or preemptive approach. Right? So we want our activism to be preemptive, to prevent catastrophes from happening rather than to reacting to them in order to lessen their evil effects and then move on to the next reaction to the new catastrophe. Tim?
Yeah, to come back to Victor's point about poor translation, or rather biased translation that reflects how a translator looks at it from an ideological point of view. I wonder if there's a case for saying that translators who are neutral, who come from another culture, might do this better than people who have grown up in the culture and are translating from their native language. Because I can imagine, for instance, that in a country such as Ukraine, most of the translators will probably be Ukrainian first language speakers, Carlos, or maybe Ukrainian and Russian, both two first language speakers. But these people, you could say, because they've grown up in this society, they will have a greater appreciation, of course, of some of its finesses, but they will also, I suspect, be biased by their personal appearance and by their cultural, preferences. Right. Now, of course, an external person may not see all these finesses, but he or she is probably more likely to look at it in an objective point of view. So I was also wondering, may there be a good case for, one good thing about learning these languages that are not so mainstream is that you actually can interpret things from shall we say, a more objective point of view, and not necessarily from the point of view of somebody who has grown up in that culture. Is just something I wanted to bring up for discussion.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Absolutely. Usman?
It's a very good point that Timothy is making about developing an appreciation, but there is also a sinister element that employs the same strategy, which is to know the language of your enemies so that you can read deeper. For example, you may wish to learn Hebrew to subvert Israel, or you may wish to learn Urdu to subvert Pakistan. I mean, there's about 100 million speakers of Urdu in India. Or you may wish to use the similar sorts of things just as an appreciation, and when the push comes to shove, your ultimate biases or your ultimate cognitive toolkit won't make you open-minded, because there may be valid reasons for you to be antagonistic. They may be invalid hijacking of all those systems, because ultimately you fall on the chessboard antagonistically to that culture. And so there's a sinister element to also learning cultures, the agenda. I need to know my enemy.
Definitely, Usman. This is a very important point, and that was one of the problems that I had, for instance, in the Polyglot conference in 2018, when Alex Rollins talked about a world ohne Grenzen, right? Borrowing from Wittgenstein. Die Grenze meiner Sprache bedeuten die Grenze meiner Welt. And the idea was that the more languages you know, then the more open-minded you are, and the more empathic and the more love you can share with all the people and all the cultures, etc. But there is an equally valid argument to the opposite, as you well pointed out. And it is, as a matter of fact, known that many in the nomenclatura of the National Socialists were multilingual, right? But we use that multilingualism for evil purposes. So there is a proclivity or a positive correlation between multilingualism and open-mindedness, but that does not necessarily mean that is always going to be the case. In fact, history proves otherwise, as you mentioned with the examples of Urdu in India, and I just mentioned apropos Germany back in the day. More reactions to this? Usman?
Thank you for bringing the National Socialist example. That's an even better example, to be honest. And research, which you may have come across, I'm sure, suggests that we are more open-minded in terms of the judgmental latitude in our second language. So because we've been trained usually at an older age in this language, and we've done it in a more adult manner, we say, well, there's two sides to the story. Why don't you, keep it in mind, as opposed to being in your mother tongue where you will say, that's how it is, and let me tell you. This is instinctive. My argument, not based on any evidence, is that when push comes to shove, your internal biases kick in. I just simply think that is an intuitive thing. I may be wrong, but when push comes to shove, especially like war zone type thing, those bastards from that people do this. It all hijacks whatever your second language thing might be. I don't know. What do you think?
I'm not sure I understood the question, Usman. Can you reformulate it, please?
My proposition is that depending on the severity of the circumstances, your innate biases may hijack whatever second language open-mindedness you might have developed.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And this is well researched. For instance, Don Snow from Duke University in Shanghai, Duke Kunshan University, has written extensively about this, and he draws upon the philosophy of mind in theory called dual system. The idea is that we have a more intuitive, reactive, instinctive way of processing information, and a more rational and critical thinking based way of doing that. But the rational and critical thinking way of doing that takes way more cognitive load, so that when we need to react quickly, or we are under severe pressure, as in a war type of conflict, then our instincts, as you said, kick in, and we might throw by the window all that we had learned in terms of a human tendency and proclivity that is well accredited and researched and demonstrated. Victor?
Okay, I do that exercise because whenever I'm writing a text, or when I'm considering something, I do try to consider it in one of the other languages at least, and I often come to different solutions.
So you mean, Victor, that you read the text in the
I read the text, I write the text. This text is okay, so let's translate to English, let's speak it in English. Oh, this is better. Now I can retranslate it into Portuguese and it's even better. Oh, this is in Spanish. Now it's great in Portuguese, English, and Spanish. And the considerations I had in my mind are even more perfect.
In what sense? Can you give a specific example?
A better text, a better explanation, sometimes a better structuring of the ideas.
All right, so an enhanced comprehension.
Comprehension, and sometimes even what I see, what I'm telling to someone,
Right.
or what I'm explaining, or what I am understanding about the same stuff.
Right. And yes, I remember an example that is typically given is a language known as Toquepona, which is a language very, very scarce in lexicality. It's only 124 words. And this forces learners of the language to try and simplify their thoughts, to their minimal components and to be as explicit and clear as they can about the idea they're expressing. So it's a very interesting exercise of enhanced comprehension through translation into a different language. Victor?
Yeah, that's right. I've been doing it for a few less text I put in my Instagram, and I'm limited to 2,200 characters, and sometimes I can't do it within the limit. But then after I translate, retranslate, and retranslate, I do a trilingual text, which is short and to the point. Understand? So I consider the best stuff I must communicate.
Mm-hmm.
And then even sometimes I come up with new ideas which come in the short text and are expressed in a better way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right, thank you, Victor. And that's another aspect that new technologies add in social media. Twitter is very, very constraining in terms of characters, and so is Instagram to a lesser extent. So that forces us to reformulate our arguments differently. We are approaching now the 60 minutes of debate. We're 2 minutes away from that. So it's probably a good idea to start wrapping it up with some last comments or interventions or points we want to make. Victor?
My main point, we must understand those people. We must understand those people. We have centuries of misunderstanding, and it's nearing a point. We see a point where the human existence is menaced because we don't understand each other.
Mm-hmm. When you say those people,
Those people are all people of East Europe. We don't know how from the time I started understanding those languages, we don't know how they relate to work. We don't know how they relate to time. We don't know how they relate to each other. And yet, all the Western countries have a fixed image of how or who they are.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's as far as I see, there's also a strong neo-Worthian implication there, which is the fact that their language has a decisively and distinctively influence in the way they perceive time and space and understand in their worldview, right? So one will have to subscribe to that strand of neo-Worthianism to be in agreement with their arguments, right? Because, for instance, John McWhorter will say, well, these people see the world basically just as we see it, with perhaps small minor differences. But then again, not everybody agrees with McWhorter either. Tim.
Okay, yes. I really like what Usman said, that we should be doing the not activism but pro-activism in order to sort of try to help to understand the people, as Victor was saying, preferably before sort of a disaster occurs. So it's just a very general question to mainly to Usman, but to all of you. Where should we, if one was hoping to make a difference through activism, where would be some places where we could start to look, and which languages might be worth learning? Would you have any guidance on that?
Yeah, so my own response to that would be the very job that I'm doing, to try and produce simple explainers on the most important concept that cloud our judgment and lead to pernicious ideas that might be divisive, and to broadcast and disseminate that to as many people as possible. And I thank you, all of you here, for disseminating those ideas and following the Hyperpolyglot Activist. And when it comes to using new languages to make a difference, in my case, for instance, I chose to learn a language that is not associated to any nation state, which again goes against the whole monolingualist ideology of the nation state that's rooted in Western Europe, right? And colonial times. So Ladino is a diasporic language. There's no Sephardic son. There is no territorial ascription of that language anywhere in the world, and yet it is a language, right? Learning it helps preserve the memories of the people who were killed in the Holocaust, amongst many other traumas experienced by Ladino speakers. So that's a way in which I make a positive contribution, I think. And teaching it, right? I'm teaching it at Oxford, at Latino 21, etc. Other people, for instance, in Respond Crisis Translation, learn languages of refugees that come into the US so that they can provide interpretation services and help those communities. So these are two examples, but I'm sure you know of many more examples. But I think that practical examples involving a specific language ought to be supplemented by that degree of reflexivity that Usman was referring to, saying, okay, let's do a meta-linguistic reflection on what are the dangers of conceptualizing languages and cultures and people in such and such and such way, and what are the alternatives we can provide, and explain that in simple terms so that everybody can understand that. Usman or Victor want to add any, or Tim for that matter, want to add any other way in which we can use languages to make a world a better place? Usman.
Thank you. Timothy has raised the core question, I think, and your suggestion, Carlos, is outstanding. So a deterritorialized language like Ladino is an excellent example. Esperantists had this spirit for 2 centuries or more. Another additional recommendation is that we should scan out of the goodness of our heart, really nothing more, where the conflict zones are in the world and see what is the major language and what is the language that may be considered similar, the same, or different, and develop an appreciation. I'll give you an example. There's a lot of heartfelt emotion about Ukraine and Russia, but I never saw the same thing with Saudi Arabia and Yemen. Not that I'm partial to either side, but it is interesting to see how the Yemenites speak differently than people from the Hijaz and the Saudi Arabia, as opposed to other forms of Arabic. That's one. Korea, South Korea has evolved its lexical content a great deal in the past 50 years. It's different from North Korea in many ways, and yet not. So that's something for us to consider. The Urdu Hindi thing, I mean, that's a huge one, and it's a lot of ahistorical misunderstandings about that. So it's actually quite interesting to see how versatile Urdu is if you want to learn anything from Persian to Arabic to a Turkic language and then Sanskrit. So that's a conflict zone. Another one is if you were interested, let's say 5 years ago in Afghanistan, you were interested in Persian, you'd also learn the Afghan Dari, and because there are differences. And how do Persians perceive Dari? They look down on it quite a bit, and how do Daris, etc. Whenever you pick a language, also look at the nuances amongst the people in that. There are quite a few, and they're in conflict zones, and that appreciation will go a long way. Thank you.
Yeah, there is a brilliant intervention, Usman, and I couldn't agree more with that. I think at the end of the day, when all is said and done, the whole discussion of Ukrainian and Russian is a deeply Eurocentric one. And it is a symptom as much as it is a solution, right? It is a solution, an empathic way of sympathizing with Ukrainians to learn Ukrainian, but it's also a symptom of the prevailing concerns of a Eurocentric viewpoint that serves to obscure similar instances around the world, right? And I think that if you take this to its logical conclusion, you could even make the claim with perfect utility that the polyglot community itself is deeply Eurocentric. And so that also helps explain why the Ukrainian versus Russian languages is so in vogue nowadays amongst the polyglot community, in a way that Gemini or South Korean or Urdu versus Hindi are not and are unlikely to be anytime soon unless we push this point further. Victor, no?
Okay, no problem, no more.
I thought you had raised your hand, but then I realized there was no hand. So, but if you have a point, then you can go ahead.
No.
Okay.
That's enough today.
All right. So that's probably a good idea. Enough for today. But now we still have to choose the topic of our next meeting, which will be the 10th meeting of HYPIA Research. We've reached double digits. Now, here are some of the suggestions that I have, but of course, you're welcome to suggest your own further topics in the chat. So we have A, language and geopolitics, B, polyglot sole ownership companies as the privatization of commons. Here, the idea is that polyglotsia or multilingualism is a community property, and aspiring to create sole ownerships of that runs counter to its very nature. C, this is something that I added today, the polyglot as a linguistic nomad. This is a metaphorization brought by Rossi Braidotti, French continental philosophy kind of thing. So drawing upon nomadism to enlighten us apropos polyglossia. D, why locals respond in English when addressed in their local language. Interesting. E, contrastive analysis in multilingual translations. And F, post-colonial and decolonial linguistics, including, for instance, colonial mimesis that we just discussed in this meeting. Let me go really quick to the chat and see what your preferences are. Please stick to just one letter to simplify and streamline the whole process. I am going to make my own choice as well.
Could you also explain the B one? I think it's fascinating, but I don't know if I fully captured it, although we voted already. I'd just like to understand that better.
The B1, Usman, is based on your article on the commons in HYPIA, right? So it's something that
Got it. Say no more.
now you understand the point, right? The idea is that polyglossia is something that is out there, and that to try and privatize that.
I love it. I love this idea.
And I don't agree with that idea, which is why I would like to discuss it. Okay, so let me see. Let me read the chat. So FF, so, and then Timothy says D, but it's only one person. So now, what if I say F? Yeah, I'm going to say F. So I'm going to say F, and that means 3 votes for F. So we will do F. I'm happy to present on that. Because
I appreciate if you did, because we can learn a lot from you in this, Carlos. So if you did it, I think it would be wonderful for us.
All right, say no more. I will do that. So our next meeting will be at the end of April, and I will be presenting on post-colonial and decolonial linguistics, readings to follow up to 1 week before the meeting, and then we will set up the time after I share a poll with all of you. So thank you so much for coming today to this meeting. It was very productive and enlightening, and I'm wishing you a very productive rest of your day. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Victor.
Thank you.